Stop buying property in your personal name and do this instead. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of new investors make is that they continue to buy property in their own personal name. Now, they do that because there's a number of benefits that can come from owning property in your personal name, like negative gearing and offsetting that against tax. However, over the long term, if your aspiration is to build a portfolio of multiple properties, I'm talking about more than one or two, then you need to be investing in structures. The reality is that the wealthy people in this country, in fact in the world, they don't own anything in their personal name. They don't have this attachment to owning belongings and assets and property and cars and shares and anything that you can imagine in their personal name, but they do have an attachment to controlling these assets. And that's a very different mindset than having to have ownership. And so what I'm talking about there is that when you own assets in a legal entity outside of your personal name, you can still control those assets, but not necessarily, and have the direct benefit from those assets without having the direct ownership. Now, this is key because ultimately there's a few reasons as to why we would want to do this. And the first one is for asset protection. If we don't own the assets personally, then effectively they're removed from any type of litigation or risk or any type of financial predator that may come after us personally and try and take assets, equity, cash that sits under our personal umbrella. But when we start to remove that away from us, we become very untouchable. For instance, I've never owned a personal asset in my own name, and it's never caused me any issues in borrowing because there's no security, and obviously offering up personal guarantees, there's nothing really there, but it has never stopped me from securing and obtaining loans. Now, when it comes to property, what we want to be doing is using what we call special purpose vehicles, SPVs. Now, SPVs are ultimately a company. It could be a hybrid trust, it could be a discretionary trust, it could be a unit trust. It really depends on the type of asset, and it depends on the intent that you have for that asset. For instance, if you are looking to raise money or raise capital, you are wanting to do that in a structure that offers more flexibility throughout the life of the asset to then either sell units or sell shares, and do that in a way that doesn't incur additional costs like stamp duty. So you need to be talking with your consultant team, your professional team, about setting up the right structures from the very get-go and really having a clear plan in place as to how you want to manage that asset moving forward. It could be just a long-term asset hold for you and your family, and so putting that into a discretionary trust, or what's known particularly as a family trust, which is a discretionary trust, could be the best option, but you want to make sure that you're seeking advice on that. Now, I must say that I am not an accountant, I'm not a financial planner, I'm not an economist, I'm none of those things, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any of those degrees. What I am is someone who has done this time and time again, and who has been driven by getting results and has done that very successfully utilizing the structures that I'm talking about here. So if we go to the iPad, effectively what we want to be doing with our SPVs is every single time we go and buy an asset, let's say it's a property that we plan on either holding or adding instant value to, what we want to be doing is putting that into an entity. And we do that by putting it into what might be called a company or corporate trustee structure. With a trust, the trust is the legal entity that owns the asset, and the company is the trustee that effectively is appointed to make decisions and act on behalf of the trust. So when we do this, essentially what we're doing is putting an insulation barrier around the asset itself. Now, one common question that I get a lot is, okay, so do I put multiple assets into the one structure? The answer to that question is typically no. What you want to be doing is creating these big quarantine barriers between each and every asset that you have to ensure that if something was to happen to this one here is left untouched. So say for instance, somebody comes onto the land and trips over, breaks their leg, and then makes a claim. Ultimately, what we want to be doing there is making sure that we've got the right insurances in place first and foremost, because that's the first layer of asset protection. But let's say for instance, the wrong insurance policy was in place, and ultimately you as the landowner is now at risk of potentially losing this property. If these properties were owned in your personal name, well, guess what? All of the assets are now in the basket and thrown into the mix and on the table. But because we've put up these big quarantine barriers, now any of our other assets are effectively untouchable because they're owned by completely separate entities. And that's the big key here, is what we want to be doing is separating them and quarantining them, isolating them on their own so that they basically become untouchable. Now, it's not to say that each and every asset is untouchable, because it ultimately still carries risk, but what we want to be doing is making sure that the assets themselves are only at risk to themselves. And so what we do is, over time, we start to build up what you might call these legal entities that own assets, and we end up with multiple assets in multiple entities. Now, the second thing that we want to be thinking about is making sure that our portfolio is not cross-securitized. So each and every asset, let's call these properties down here, in these individual entities have debt with different lenders. So you're not mixing up assets under, say, a loan agreement that could potentially be at risk with another lender. So what we're doing is we're really going to individual lenders for individual assets and individual trust structures. What this typically does is it opens up the market and the products that we can then get access to at the individual entity level, and allows us to typically get access to greater amounts of capital. Now, if we are forcing equity and adding instant value to properties, these might be short-term deals, okay? So they might only have a lifespan of somewhere between 6 to 18 months, maybe a little bit more depending on the type of strategy that you're undertaking. But ultimately, once that's done, is you're gonna take the profit off the table. You're gonna either distribute that to another entity or to yourself personally, wherever you're going to get the greatest tax efficiency. And you're then going to close this entity down, because it ultimately is going to have liability or contingent liability that sits within that. And we don't want any type of contamination in future assets that we may try and repurpose this entity for. We just close it down, deregister it, and then go and set up another one. Now, one of the common questions that I get quite a bit is, well, how much does it really cost to set up a legal entity every time we want to buy a property? And is that cost actually worth it? Well, typically speaking, the cost to set up a structure, whether that be a trust with a company or just a company itself, is going to be around, say, $1,500 to $2,000 per entity. And then you're going to have ongoing management costs of that entity in the form of a company registration fee to ASIC, which is normally about $300, $320 per year. And then you're also going to have a tax return that's lodged at the end of the financial year as well, which might cost you $1,500. So there's a little bit of ongoing management expenses in having these entities set up, but ultimately, if you're choosing the right assets to own either long-term or short-term and making profits within those entities, those profits and those gains that you're getting in your portfolio should far outweigh any small cost in owning the asset itself. Typically speaking, the benefit of asset protection and the tax minimization strategies that you get the benefit of by structuring yourself in this way far outweigh any small costs in setting them up and then managing them long term. Let's put it this way. If you had a portfolio of 5 properties that you had built up over, say, 10 years, and each of those properties is worth $1 million each, well, you've got $5 million worth of value there that you may not have a lot of debt against. And so do you really want $5 million of value just flapping out there in the wind, exposed to all types of litigators, predators, and so on and so forth? Absolutely not. You want it protected. You're creating generational wealth. You want to be able to hand this down to your loved ones when you eventually pass away. And so to do that, you've got to think the way that the rich and the wealthy do. And they think about tax efficiency, they think about asset protection, they think about ensuring that they don't have cross-contamination between assets and cross-securitization with lenders. They think smart and strategically, and you should too. Just because you don't have the sort of wealth or the sort of income that you would like to have right now, if you're building up to that level, well, you really want to be thinking about it with some foresight to ensure that you set yourself up correctly from day one. And look, one of the questions that I get a lot as well is, well, what's the chances of me being sued? And the answer to that is, look, who knows, right? But what we do know is that New South Wales is the second highest litigated state in the world behind California. So this stuff is rife. You can never predict the future. No one has a crystal ball, but what you can do is protect yourself the best possible way that you know how, which is to properly structure your assets in legal entities that you do not own, but you do control and that you do get the full financial benefit from. I hope that you enjoyed that video. If you've got any questions, put them down into the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video, and I'll see you on the next one.